night, and welcome back to the episode 3 of What the Hell is Going On Out There. In this episode, we're going to talk about the oil market, and I'll do my best to explain how we got into this just absolutely crazy market position that we're in right now. And I say absolutely crazy because right now, today, at 3:32, April 20, 2020, the price per barrel of crude oil has dropped below zero for, as far as I know, the first time ever. Now just think about that for a second. The price is negative. That means a seller of oil will literally pay you $10 to take a barrel of oil off their hands. Just months ago, prices were climbing above $50 per barrel. Right? So how the hell did we get to this point? First, let me give you a short primer on the way the oil markets work in general, because you can't understand how something went wrong unless you understand how it should have gone right. So the oil market works like this. First, companies find and drill for raw oil somewhere out in the world. This raw oil is called crude oil, and it comes in a lot of different forms. But it is produced by drilling wells into pockets deep in the Earth's crust that once contained decomposing organic matter. And over the course of millennia, that organic matter turned into oil. Basically, crude oil is the long dead remains of plants, animals, and dinosaurs that used to roam the earth. This crude oil is pumped to the surface and then sold to the highest bidder. The buyer then needs to transport the oil to a processing plant, which is called a refinery, where the crude oil can be turned into consumer products like gasoline, kerosene, waxes, lubricating oils, and even asphalt. Tons and tons of things are made out of crude oil. It just so happens that the biggest and most important thing is gasoline. Once the gas and other products have been refined from crude oil, they can be stored and then eventually sold to consumers around the world. Oil is one of the world's biggest markets and one of the most important products out there. In other words, the oil economy runs on oil, not on Dunkin'. And that means that things that affect the economy affect the oil market and vice versa. Now, one of the most important things to know about the oil market is that the entire market is pretty much dominated by a handful of huge players. There are some giant multinational companies like Exxon and Chevron and Total, and there are some giant state-owned companies like Petrobras in Brazil and Statoil in Norway and Aramco in Saudi Arabia. These companies dominate the production of crude. And by and large, they dominate the refining of crude into consumer products. Some of these countries and their state-owned oil enterprises are such big players that back in 1960, they established a multinational cartel aimed at keeping the market for oil stable and profitable. This cartel is called OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. This was mostly because many of the biggest oil-producing countries other than the United States keep all of their oil revenue rather than letting it go to a shareholder-owned company. And that is how these countries mostly fund their national budgets. Thus, the government of these countries have a strong vested interest in keeping prices high and stable. They don't want their oil revenue to dry up or the government will run out of money, and that can cause instability in the governing regime. Now, some of you may be asking, wait a minute, what is a cartel again? And a cartel is a group of businesses that have agreed between them to charge a fixed price for a product. And they do that regardless of the demand for the product. So they don't let the price fluctuate according to the market's supply and demand. Instead, they fix supply so that the price is exactly where they want it to be. Now, in the US and most other nations, this is typically an illegal business practice because of the negative impact price fixing has on consumers who want to buy a product. Cartels always make something more expensive because it benefits the seller, rather than letting the price fluctuate, which might benefit the consumer. However, because OPEC is being run by a bunch of countries, it couldn't be outlawed. They were just too big to be illegal. The US simply couldn't stop them, especially when they control the great majority of the world's oil supply. So for decades, OPEC essentially ran the world's oil market. They said jump, and everyone else said how high. During this period, They were single-handedly responsible for causing a number of oil shortages in countries around the world, especially when other countries tried to get in the way of their price fixing. In one notable incident, during the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, Arab members of the organization of OPEC imposed an embargo against the US in retaliation for the US decision to resupply the Israeli military and to gain leverage in the post-war peace negotiations. This caused massive shortages of gasoline in the US, and it gave rise to some of the famous pictures you may have seen of drivers waiting in lines hundreds of cars long at the pump, trying to get whatever small amount of gas was available at sky-high prices. In response to this and other oil embargoes, many countries invested large amounts into oil exploration and production. New methods were developed to dig for and find crude oil, and a great many more oil deposits were discovered and developed all over the world. This gave rise to things like deep water oil platforms, fracking, shale drilling, and many other new and improved production methods. The response was fast, and within another couple decades, OPEC had only a shadow of its former power. They could no longer shut down the world via an oil embargo because the rest of the world had started to produce its own oil. By 2010 or so, the US had even overtaken Saudi Arabia as the largest oil-producing nation in the world, largely due to an increase in fracking, shale drilling, and increased production in the Permian Basin of Texas, coming from very deep wells, all of which required significant improvement in oil production. Russia, Mexico, and many other countries had also been producing oil, but they refused to join the OPEC cartel. Not surprisingly, all of this competition at once brought some market pressure and at the same time instability into oil markets. When you just have one player that sets the supply and price of oil, the market is very predictable. But when the cartel is just one of many big players in the market, we see the normal forces of supply and demand return to the fore. Now, OPEC was and still is the 800-pound gorilla in the market because combined, the OPEC countries still produce a majority of the world's supply of crude. It's just that their ability to control total supply is now more limited. And now, if they want to reduce supply and try to raise prices, it's much harder on the member nations of OPEC. Because there are other producers in the market that aren't a part of OPEC. And if OPEC tries to reduce the supply, these other producers will increase production and try to steal market share. Thus, OPEC has to reduce supply by even more to account for this kind of competitive pressure. And that makes these kinds of cuts very, very hard on an OPEC member's national budget. So the organization of the cartel has gotten more and more difficult. And the Saudis have had a much tougher time keeping the cartel together and keeping the members from cheating on the arrangement. Over the last 15 years or so, the price per barrel of unrefined crude oil has fallen from a peak in 2008 of $148 per barrel to in the 50s over the last 5 years, and finally today to negative $10 per barrel. Negative 10. A great deal of the price falling from 2008 to 2015 was simply due to more oil being produced by the US, by Russia, by many other countries, more than it had ever been before. And excess supply means falling prices. This has not been beneficial for most oil-producing country budgets. That included some of the countries like Mexico and Russia that were relatively new producers on the world stage. And because of this, OPEC was able to finally convince these countries to collaborate with the OPEC cartel without actually becoming full official members. They formed what started to be called OPEC Plus. And for the next several years, this arrangement worked relatively well. All that until this January. In January, at a routine meeting of OPEC Plus, the Russians and Saudis got into a disagreement over a proposed supply cut the Saudis wanted to put in place in order to try to raise the price of oil. The Russians and a few other nations did not want to cut the supply because that would reduce the revenue that the government was bringing in. And these governments are already in tough financial positions. So the Russians refused to cooperate, and the meeting ended without an agreement. The Saudis, however, retaliated against the Russian intransigence by doing the exact opposite of what they had planned. Instead, they increased production, very nearly to the maximum amount they were able to. The Russians replied in kind, and a sudden glut of crude oil came on the market. Millions of barrels of additional oil more than the market was prepared to handle. Millions more than they had produced in the same month the previous year. This was the beginning of the oil price war that started to make the news in January. It was also the beginning of the slow, steady fall in gasoline prices that you may have seen at the pump. We refine gasoline from crude oil, so if crude prices fall, then gas prices fall. Remember our basic economics. When supply exceeds demand, the only response is for the market price to fall, as a way to try and increase demand and reintroduce market equilibrium. So if nothing else had happened, this spat would have eventually resolved itself, and the biggest outcome would have been a period of really low gas prices that we all got to enjoy for a while. Instead, the coronavirus exploded on the global scene, and governments worldwide locked down their countries in response to the pandemic. One of the outcomes of these lockdowns has been a drastic decrease in the demand for gas, and thus ultimately in the demand for crude. People aren't driving even a fraction as much as normal. Have you seen the pictures of the clear skies over giant cities in China and Los Angeles and New York and San Francisco? All that car-generated smog is gone because people aren't driving. And this has done a number on an oil market that was already gorged on supply. The Saudis and Russians continued to fight their war without paying much attention to the broader market developments. And by the time they finally reached a peace deal, in part brokered by the US, just a little over a week ago, it was already too late. The market is completely saturated. We are quite literally running out of places to store all the oil that has been produced since January, and more is still being produced every day. The world is projected to run out of oil storage in the next few weeks. It means that the oil still being produced will have nowhere to go. We may see countries like Saudi Arabia dumping oil in giant pits on the ground because they simply don't have another option. And that level of oversupply is another historic effect of this pandemic. We had simply never conceived of this possibility. The market just doesn't know what to do. It is this incredible level of oversupply that has finally pushed crude oil prices into the negatives. Producers will literally pay you to take oil off their hands because no one is buying, and no one can store what they do buy. It's a gigantic mess, and absent the easing of lockdown restrictions, there's no end in sight. Even when they do ease, the travel that the world was used to may not rise to the pre-pandemic levels for quite a while, which means we may continue to see historically low prices for a considerable time. So my advice to you, enjoy that while it lasts. Although, in a weird, warped way, it's our ability to go out and take advantage of these low prices. That's precisely why they're so low in the first place. So perhaps we can't enjoy it after all. In that case, just grab some popcorn and watch the oil market go up in glorious flames.
I'm only burning my half.
At least until this is all over. Until next time.